I know the cost of war. The sacrifices made by our troops and military families are immeasurable.
The urgency cannot be overstated that we need to bring our troops home from Afghanistan as quickly and safely as possible. In that situation, I was in a medical unit in Iraq, saw and was faced with extreme injury and death on a daily basis. In the camp that we were at, about 40 miles north of Baghdad, there was a huge sign on one of the main gates where the patrols went in and out of every day. And the big sign said in big black letters, "Is today the day?" The big question mark. So if any one of us ever at any moment forgot about the fragility of life in that place at that time, there was that stark reminder that our time could come at any moment.
How did combat change you?
It changed my life in so many different ways. My own personal perspective, who I am as a person, of realizing what's important, what's not, as well as from a political sense and how we're dealing with national policies. The true cost of war, not just being the dollars and cents, the lives that are sacrificed, but also the long-term impact. I think the opposite question could be asked is, would it not be potentially irresponsible to take action against Syria just for the sake of saying we took action against Syria when that action could lead to something far worse, whether it be a regional conflict, whether it be a weakened Syrian regime and a strengthened opposition forces which is made up of multiple terrorist factions who could have access to weapons and who have said very clearly their desire to hurt the United States and hurt the United States' interest. Again, I think it is our responsibility to exercise moral courage, to find that right solution. It's not a question of a military strike or complete and total inaction. The question is, we need to take effective action, and I think that's what we're seeing now occurring with the developments today within the UN. I served in a medical unit during that deployment to Iraq in 2005 and was faced on a daily basis with that most harsh cost of war, both of people who I knew and who I served with, who I spoke about recently during Memorial Day, and people who were from all over the country, from all different branches of service. We've got to do a couple of things. We've got to understand what's happening here, and then we've got to take a very clear-eyed look at seeing what impact, if any, can these airstrikes or other involvement actually make on the situation on the ground. The situation being, this is a religious civil war that's occurring between two Muslim factions, the Sunni and the Shia. Largely, this is coming about today because of this invasion that we did in Iraq a decade ago, where you have a government that had the opportunity, Maliki had the opportunity to create a unity government, bringing together the Shia and Sunni parts of the country and actually bring about peace. That did not occur. Instead, you have a government that has been oppressing the Sunni Iraqi people and has been discriminating against them and has really brought this about, where you have this continuing battle between the Sunnis and the Shias.
Congresswoman,
I think, sorry, if I just want to jump in, you have to define who are the bad guys. It's easy to say, let's go in and get the bad guys, but you have a divided country of Sunnis and Shias. The United States goes and takes action there on behalf of the Iraqi government, Maliki. You've got Iran coming in and saying, well, we're going to stand with Maliki. So now we're aligning ourselves with Iran, and essentially, if we do airstrikes, becoming de facto air force for them. Or you have the Sunni Islamic terrorists who are fighting. So who are you deciding who are the bad guys? And the perception to the Iraqi people would not be that the United States is coming to fight for us, because they're part of this divided country.
Well, I disagree, because the Iraqi people have asked, and the Iraqi government has asked for the United States' help.
It is, of course, though, and I know you're not disputing this, it is, of course, very complicated. For instance, ISIS, in addition to being opposed to the Iraqi government, is opposed to the Syrian government. And many people wanted strikes against Assad. Well, guess what? ISIS wanted strikes against Assad, too. But if there's ever been a condition for blowback, this would be it. I mean, you don't know who you root against. And Congresswoman Gabbard, I want to give you the final word. One of the things that the American intelligence and military communities are very worried about is ISIS, not just there in Syria and Iraq, but actually coming back to the United States and doing things here in the United States. Is it not better to get them now there as opposed to having to deal with it later on?
Once again, you've got to be able to define who we're helping or who we're fighting against. Whether you're talking about Iraq, you're talking about Syria, you have many different complicated things going on that ultimately result in two civil wars that are happening. If we are, which I do not advocate for getting involved in either Iraq or Syria, if we're concerned about a direct threat to the United States or our interest from ISIS or other terrorist factions anywhere else in the world, we should focus our resources on those direct threats and take them out where they are, not getting mired into other civil wars that could end up costing many more lives and hundreds of billions more dollars. It is not in our U.S. interest to go and involve ourselves in the middle of what is a religious civil war. Are there specific security threats to the United States coming from terrorist factions? Yes, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and many other countries in the world. We have to focus our resources that we have, focus our great military on those direct and imminent threats rather than getting distracted by involving ourselves in another civil war that's occurring in another country between religious factions that have been warring for generations. Taking that action, taking military action, conducting airstrikes, dropping bombs based on poor intelligence without having real-time intelligence and boots on the ground that can provide that, taking sides in this religious civil war not only is not in the best U.S. national interest, it doesn't even solve the problem of what is existing there. If we want to take action, we should push for brokering. We should push for brokering a peaceful agreement between these warring factions within the country and support leadership in Iraq that's willing to do that.
And that end game is critically important because we saw, as we saw in Iraq, the war that we both served in, there wasn't a strategy, there wasn't an end game, there wasn't really a clear objective, unless, of course, you want to argue that there was weapons of mass destruction and that connection to 9/11, which we both know was a fallacy.
And to follow through on that, one thing that we also saw that went wrong in Iraq, and as we're seeing some of these questions are not being asked of ourselves as the United States often enough, is what are the second, third, and fourth courses of action and effects that impact us? If we take course of action A, what are the next 10 steps or consequences that could occur, which is why we found ourselves in such a protracted conflict in Iraq, because, for example, you create that vacuum of leadership. It's filled by others who do not have that same intent in mind of a peaceful and stable country. You see that happening in Libya right now as we speak. So as we look at the broader picture, these are the things that we absolutely must keep in mind.
Representative Gabbard, you spoke strongly yesterday against arming the Syrian rebels. Can you explain why?
My vote against that resolution yesterday was specifically because I understand how dangerous it is to go to war, to engage our military when the mission is unclear. And that's the biggest problem that we have here, is that we have different perspectives, different missions. We're talking about engaging the Syrian military to overthrow Assad. We're looking at continuing this nation-building mission in Iraq, when essentially what our mission should be is going against the Islamic extremists who have declared war against us. This is part of the problem, is people are looking at this in the wrong perspective, that this is about the countries called Iraq or Syria, when in reality, our mission, the United States, should be focused on taking out the Islamic extremists who declared war against us on 9/11. It's why I joined the military. It's why a lot of other people joined the military, to fight that fight. And unfortunately, that fight, that war, has largely been forgotten.
But in Syria, again, where ISIS has a lot of territory, it's really, I mean, all the military folks I've talked to say you have to deal with them in Syria as well as in Iraq. So who are you actually going to partner with in Syria, if not some form of Syrian opposition forces?
Well, first of all, the proposal that has been presented by the president to Congress, which we voted on yesterday, which I voted against, was really, honestly, it wasn't a serious proposal to take out our enemy. When you look at the details of it, it was not focused on a mission to take out our enemy. It was focused also primarily on the objective of overthrowing Assad. The numbers were not realistic. There's no trusted vetting process to know that the weapons that we provide to the Syrian, so-called Syrian opposition forces won't end up in the wrong hands, or whether their loyalties will be switched elsewhere. This is exactly the problem. There's not a clear focus on what our mission is.
There does seem to be a sort of a general feeling in Congress that they're not comfortable any longer with so much action occurring on previous authority that was granted before either the president or Congress knew fully what the threat was over there.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think as we talk about different strategies and authorities and all these different determinations, the most important question is not being asked enough, which is, what is our mission as a country? What are we trying to accomplish? What our mission is not is it's not nation building. It should not be occupying. It should not be overthrowing dictators and trying to rebuild other nations. Our mission should be very focused. I know myself, along with a lot of my other brothers and sisters from Hawaii, joined the military in answering that call to action by our nation's leaders.
Right.
We can look to the past and see many different examples of where this has occurred, whether you look at Libya, you look at Egypt, you look at what's being proposed with Syria. In each of these different instances, a dictator has been removed. There has been an attempt to institute a Western-style democracy, and in each of these cases, ISIS and Islamic extremists are more powerful and presenting a greater threat than they did before. Well, you know, Wolf, the way that I look at this is from a strategic standpoint, and this is why I feel so strongly that it's important for the president, important for the White House, the administration, the leaders in Congress as well, in both parties, to recognize that we've got to learn from the mistakes of the past in order to effectively defeat this enemy that's threatening us and threatening the safety of the American people. And the first step that must come to do in order to do that is identifying and understanding who they are and what's driving them, and executing a simultaneous military and ideological strategy to defeat them. If we don't do that, then we're going to continue to find ourselves in this endless cycle, just as we've seen has occurred in the past over and over again. You know, it's clear that there's never really been a clear and intelligent strategy when you're talking about battling ISIS in Syria. And whatever limited strategy there was, namely this train and equip mission of these so-called moderate Syrian rebels, it was a fool's errand from the beginning. I voted against it when it came before us in Congress because I knew that it wouldn't work. The mind-boggling thing now is that not only have we spent, $500 million to train around 60 or so of these rebels who are now, no one knows exactly where they are. We've got folks back here at home, and this is what I think about. We've got folks here at home, veterans and service members, you know, whose benefits and pay are being threatened, saying that there's not enough money, veterans not getting the care that they need. And meanwhile, we've spent over $8 million on each one of these so-called Syrian moderates that we've trained there.
What is it that you see about them? Is it that they're not willing, or they don't think the U.S. has their backs? What is it?
You know, you could look at any one of a number of things, but when I look at this, I see this roughly a platoon-sized element dropped into combat there to battle ISIS that we've poured all this money into, when right next to them, the irony is we have these Kurdish fighters who have proven to be the most effective, to be the most courageous, to have taken back key territory from ISIS in northern Iraq as well as in Syria. And what's happening now is that U.S. and NATO are standing by and supporting Turkey as Turkey bombs these same Kurdish fighters who have been that ground fighting force, the only ground fighting force effective against ISIS on the ground. Well, I think this is just, frankly, an indication of the lack of a clear strategy to defeat ISIS. The fact that you've got kind of this schizophrenic approach where you've got U.S. air support providing some cover and some assistance to these Kurdish fighters on the ground. But on the other hand, you've got the U.S. and NATO supporting Turkey, bombing these same fighters. It just makes absolutely no sense. I'm deeply concerned, Rachel, with what's happening there in Syria, but for its reasons that go deeper even than all of the news reports that we're hearing. The real concern that I see here is that our leaders continue to lose sight of what our mission really is, what the United States mission really is. And this is something that we saw started after 9/11 with President Bush, when he went into, rather than focusing on defeating al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and these other Islamic extremist groups, instead he was distracted by removing secular dictators like Saddam Hussein. We saw this continued with President Obama and then Secretary Clinton in the removal of Gaddafi in Libya. And in both of those situations, Rachel, we have seen the results. The results are countries that are overrun with chaos and Islamic extremists. And this is the danger that we're seeing now with this lack of focus on mission and who our enemy really is in Syria. And here's the irony in all of this. And the thing that's deeply concerning to me is that the United States is actually partnering with these Islamic extremists on the ground, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, ISIS, and others, in supporting the removal of Assad, rather than focusing on defeating our enemy, those who attacked us on 9/11. Because what happens is, as the United States and others are focused on saying Assad must go, if Assad is overthrown tomorrow, these Islamic extremist groups who are united by one purpose, and that is to take over Syria, overrun the country, and present a greater threat, not only to the Middle East, but to the world.
The White House would say, the administration would say that there's a way to be opposed to Assad, but be unwilling to fight that war, and instead to prioritize fighting ISIS. They would say they're trying to thread that needle. I think they'd concede that it's difficult.
Well, first of all, I can tell you as a soldier, I know a very basic concept, and that is you don't defeat your enemy by also simultaneously helping them at the same time. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, all of these different groups are focused on removing Assad because they know that if he goes, they will be first ones in the door. And what we've seen on the ground, the chaos and the human suffering we've seen so far will only grow by many multiples, but we'll also see now these groups will have all these capabilities that Assad currently has. So you know what Russia sees right now is they see this outcome if Assad falls. So they're attacking these groups, these Islamic extremist groups who are trying to take over this country in Syria. And what I'm saying is for us in the United States, what's in our best national interest is to focus on exactly who our enemy is and not continue to fall into these same mistakes of the past and get into this mission of toppling secular dictators that we know will end very badly, not only for the people in the region, but for the American people as well.
What happened? Because you were supposed to be here as a leader of the DNC, and all of a sudden you're still in Hawaii.
As you know, I've been pretty vocal about calling out for more debates. I've been calling for more debates to give the American people the opportunity to hear from these presidential candidates, to listen to what they've got to say, to hold them accountable for their views and their positions. Because that differentiated from the decision that the chairwoman made from the DNC, I was told that I was no longer welcome to come to the debate.
So Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the chair of the DNC, what you're saying is she ordered one of her aides to call up your staffer and say, you know what, don't come. Is that what happened?
There was a conversation between her chief and my chief. Debbie's chief had called mine and basically spoke about an interview that I had, talking about the need and the call that the American people are having for more debates, for democracy, for increasing the engagement that we need in our society as we look to see who will lead our country into the future. The prevailing message of that was because I continued to call for more debates that I should not go to the debate there in Las Vegas.
Tulsi Gabbard, the Hawaii Democrat and DNC vice chair, disinvited from the Democratic debate. Congresswoman Representative Tulsi Gabbard goes on the record, and I should say new major in the Army National Guard. Is that right? Having been promoted yesterday to major?
Yes, it was a very special and moving ceremony.
Well, congratulations, and I should also say aloha. Now, tell me, what is the problem here? Aloha. What is the problem here? Because Debbie Wasserman Schultz says that you were not disinvited. Were you disinvited from the debate or not?
Greta, yes, I was, and I'll leave it at that. We're about to kick off the debate here shortly, and I think it's important for us to focus on the variety of very substantive and important issues that the American people are concerned about and that are facing our country. Greta, you know, I've been very public and vocal about my belief in democracy and my strong feeling that not only there should be more debates and opportunities for the American people to hear from our presidential candidates, but also that this exclusivity clause should be removed. I know one issue that's on the top of my mind, if I can bring it up here, is what's happening right now in Syria, what's happening in the Middle East. We just heard news yesterday about the administration dropping 50 tons of weapons in northern Syria.
We have no confidence to whose hands those weapons are going into. All we do know is that they will end up in the hands of one stripe of Islamic extremists or another, because these are the people who are fighting to overthrow Assad, whether it's Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, or these other Islamic extremist groups. So I think it's important for the candidates to answer the question tonight. Do you support, what is your position on working with our enemy, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and these other groups in overthrowing Assad, when we know for sure that if and when Assad is overthrown, considering their theory and their mission, then ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these Islamic extremist groups will take over, and we will see a humanitarian disaster like never before and a greater threat to our country and the world. I'll be watching tonight, Greta, and I want to mention one more issue that I've been really vocal about within Congress, and that is the issue of the Kurds, who have been our most effective ground fighting force in the fight against ISIS, both in Iraq as well as in Syria. We've got a situation here where Turkey has been targeting these very same Kurds. They have been targeting and dropping hundreds and hundreds of bombs, attacking these ground fighters who have been those who've been most effective against ISIS. The fact that the administration has stood silently by and allowed this to happen, including NATO, I think it's important for those candidates on the stage tonight to address this situation and to address how they will approach this in taking action. It's a bigger issue here that I'm concerned with, and that is the fact that the U.S. and the CIA are working to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, while Russia, a longtime ally of Assad for decades now, is working to defend or uphold this Syrian government of Assad. And this puts us in a position of a possible direct head-to-head conflict with Russia as long as the U.S. and CIA continue down this path.
Well, how does the U.S. and Russia avoid that head-on contact? Because you're absolutely right. The U.S. wants to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. The Russians want to boost him and protect him together with the Iranians, their allies, the Lebanese Hezbollah group. They're trying to prop him up. So how do you avoid that potential collision?
Very simple. The U.S. and the CIA should stop this illegal and counterproductive war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, and should stay focused on fighting against who our enemy is, the Islamic extremist groups. Because right now we're seeing why this is counterproductive. By working towards that end, by working towards overthrowing the Syrian government of Assad, we are not only strengthening our enemy, the Islamic extremists, who will walk in and take over all of the country of Syria. Right now they have about half of the country under their control, but it also puts us in that position of a potential direct head-to-head conflict with Russia, which brings us to the brink of a potential larger conflict of a World War III type situation.
Why do you say the U.S. effort to get rid of Bashar al-Assad's regime is counterproductive and illegal?
Well, first of all, there's not been a vote in Congress to authorize the use of force, to authorize a war to overthrow a sovereign government. For as long as I've been there, that hasn't happened. It didn't happen before I got there. So the American people haven't had a choice to speak their voice, to approve or disapprove such a war. Therefore, it's illegal. Secondly, it is counterproductive because right now, U.S. arms are getting into the hands of our enemy, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, these other groups, Islamic extremist groups who are our sworn enemy. These are groups who attacked us on 9/11 and who supposedly we're trying to defeat, yet at the same time supporting them with these arms to overthrow this Syrian government.
So you don't even want the U.S. to provide weapons or arms to these anti-Bashar al-Assad rebels?
I don't want the U.S. government to provide weapons to Al-Qaeda, to Islamic extremists, to our enemy. I think it's a very simple concept in my mind that you can't defeat your enemy if you're arming them and helping them at the same time. It makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Have you told this to officials at the White House?
We've had conversations, both in hearings and otherwise, and I think it's important for the American people to stand up and say, look, we don't want to go and do what happened in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, do what happened in Libya with Gaddafi, because these are countries that have fallen into chaos and that have been taken over by these terrorists because of the actions that the United States and others took.
You tweeted recently, any candidate who supports a safe no-fly zone in Syria must admit that U.S. coalition ground air troops are needed to enforce.
Yes.
That's a statement directed at Hillary Clinton, who now supports a no-fly zone. The president opposes a no-fly zone, at least for now.
It was a statement directed at all of our presidential candidates because as they are asked these questions and are taking positions on them, I think it's important for the American people to understand exactly what those positions mean. People are calling them different things, a no-fly zone or a safe zone, but for those who are pushing for this, they've got to be held accountable for the decision they're making, that this will require U.S. air assets to enforce it. It will require U.S. air assets to take out anti-aircraft missile defense systems, for example, that the Syrian government has. And again, that puts us into a direct head-to-head conflict with a sovereign government, the government of Syria, and with Russia and their allies, and will also require a very large amount of ground troops on the ground to enforce this. There are a slew of other issues with this and why I think a no-fly zone would be a terrible mistake.
Yeah, and I know you're obviously very concerned about what happened in Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi. The current situation there is...
The same thing will happen all over again.
It's a disaster.
It concerns me deeply to see this tremendous and tragic human suffering. I think it's important for leaders of the world, leaders here in the United States, to look at this issue, though, and say, okay, if you do in Syria what happened in Libya, what happened in Iraq, because the same things that are being said about Assad right now were said about Gaddafi. They were said about Saddam Hussein by those who were advocating for the U.S. to go in and intervene, to overthrow those regimes and those dictators. The fact is that if that happens here in Syria, as U.S. leaders and others are advocating for, we will end up with a situation far worse than we're seeing today. We'll end up in a situation with far greater human suffering, with far greater persecution of religious minorities and Christians in Syria, and our enemy will be far stronger. They will take over the entire country of Syria. They will have greater weapons and capabilities and present a greater threat not only to the people in the region, but to the world. When you look at the groups that are on the ground there, the most effective fighting groups who are fighting to overthrow this government, the Syrian government of Assad, they are predominantly ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and these other Islamic extremist groups. They make up the vast majority of these so-called Syrian rebels. They are the most effective force who has gained the most territory. So the people who they're attacking in the Russians are dropping bombs are these Al-Qaeda, people who are our enemy, people who attacked us on 9/11.
So you're basically saying you don't want your fellow soldiers, and you're a member of the Hawaii National Guard. You just were promoted from captain to major. You served in Iraq. You don't want the men and women of the U.S. military on the ground in any of those areas. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, there's no reason for them to go and be deployed to these situations. I think it's important for us, first and foremost, to recognize, A, who our enemy is, and B, what our mission is. Our mission is to defeat our enemy, not to take action that's counterproductive to that mission and help our enemy get stronger. It's a very simple premise, and I think it's important for us to focus on that. First of all, you have the Kurds, who are the most effective ground fighters in both Iraq and Syria against ISIS. They're leading this offensive attack in Mount Sinjar right now. The problem is the United States is still not providing the arms, the heavy weapons, and the equipment necessary for the Kurds to really be able to gain this strong, decisive advantage. You know, as U.S. policy is to continue to funnel these weapons and equipment through the Iraqi government, very little of which gets to the Kurds, because the Iraqi government is this Shia-led government that is continuing to disenfranchise the Kurds and the Sunni tribes. So there's got to be a strong, decisive military approach to this. And the political solution is one of a three-state solution where you've got the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds who are able to secure and govern over their own territories.
Recently on Real Time with Bill Maher, October 30th, you said if you're sending troops into harm's way, you have to clearly identify what the mission is, who the enemy is. I should also point out you've been critical of Hillary Clinton and most of the Republican candidates and what you've called interventionists.
Here's what I'm concerned about, Bill, is that we end up in November of next year, and we end up with the frontrunner, Hillary, and many of the Republican candidates that we're seeing who are essentially interventionists and who are taking positions that will put us in yet another position, just as we've seen over the last decade, of getting into a regime change, nation building mission, which is essentially what they're advocating for right now in Syria. As far as my comments about the interventionist policies of many of the frontrunners and many of the candidates who are running for president right now, relates to Syria and the illegal, counterproductive war that's taking place, that's supported by the United States to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad. And I say it's illegal because the United States Congress, the American people, have not taken a vote to authorize the overthrow of a Syrian government, of this sovereign government. It's counterproductive because it is working toward the same objective as ISIS, as Al-Qaeda, as al-Nusra, as these Islamic extremist groups who are seeking to overthrow this government so they can establish this extremist Islamic caliphate, which will wage even more terror across the region and create a greater threat to the region as well as to the world.
But what you were saying regarding ISIS, you said that you're worried that the administration, and these were the comments from October 30th, that the administration is essentially with the Islamic extremists on the ground there who are working to overthrow Assad. To that, they can take over and establish their own Islamic caliphate. That is regime change.
That's correct. And we should not be in the regime change, nation building business. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past, the mistakes of overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Iraq, of overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya, both situations which resulted not in the strengthening of the United States, but actually strengthening our enemy, creating a greater threat to the United States, strengthening these Islamic extremist groups. And for those who are advocating for no-fly zones in Syria, those who are advocating for the overthrow of the Syrian government of Assad are advocating for the exact same thing that occurred in both Iraq and Syria. The result will be exactly the same: more chaos, a strengthened enemy in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and these other groups, and a greater threat to the United States and to the world.
You say leave President Bashar al-Assad in power right now. The U.S. has other more urgent business in fighting ISIS in Syria. But listen to what the president said on that today. Listen to this, Congresswoman.
And there are still disagreements between the parties, including, most critically, over the fate of Bashar Assad, who we do not believe has a role in Syria's future because of his brutal rule. His war against the Syrian people is the primary root cause of this crisis. What is different this time, and what gives us some degree of hope, is that, as I said, for the first time, all the major countries on all sides of the Syrian conflict agree on a process that is needed to end this war.
All right, Congresswoman, has he convinced you that you got to get rid of Bashar al-Assad?
The cause of this humanitarian crisis, the cause of these refugees, the cause of the chaos on the ground in Syria is the fact that the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and these other countries have been arming these forces and waging this war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, this illegal war. It's counterproductive. It has only worked over the years, as we're seeing now today, to strengthen our enemy, strengthen ISIS, strengthen Al-Qaeda, as it's helped them attain their objective, move closer to their objective.
So what do you want the president to do?
Number one priority, stop this illegal, counterproductive war to overthrow the government of Assad.
You say it's illegal. Why is it illegal?
It's illegal because Congress has not, the American people have not declared war against this sovereign Syrian government of Assad. It's counterproductive because it is working towards the exact same objective that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and these other Islamic extremist groups are trying to achieve. And if they achieve that, they will have all of that territory under their command, and they will present a greater humanitarian threat to the region as well as a greater threat to the world. We need to stop the illegal war and focus one-pointedly on our enemy, focus one-pointedly on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these Islamic extremists who have just conducted this horrific attack in Paris and who pose a threat to the region and civilization as a whole.
So specifically in terms of sending U.S. troops into Syria to fight ISIS, and to Iraq for that matter, but specifically in Syria, you're ready for the president to send U.S. troops in there?
Absolutely not. I think it would be counterproductive to our goal, our mission, which is to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
It seems that there's been a diminished allied involvement in this struggle against ISIS.
And I'll tell you why, because people are being distracted by this mission to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad. And the United States, unfortunately, is playing right into that. If the United States leads and sets the tone, saying ISIS and Al-Qaeda, these people are a threat to us all, gather our partners, gather people who are serious about this fight, and gather those resources and have a strategy to effectively do it. It's being diminished and diluted right now by this regime change mission that should not occur. We need to stop that illegal war and not make the same mistakes that have been made in the past.
Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, during the Democratic debate, she said, "We are where we need to be in the fight against ISIS." Are we?
I would heartily disagree with that. We've got a strategy that's being executed, frankly, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I've been calling for an end to the counterproductive illegal war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, and very specifically talking about how dangerous a no-fly zone in Syria would be. We heard the president talk the other day about his opposition to a no-fly zone. But at the same time, we've heard from many of our presidential candidates how they're advocating for a no-fly zone. I don't see how your head can be screwed on straight if you're pushing for a no-fly zone when we hear people like Chris Christie and Marco Rubio saying that they would shoot down a Russian plane that violates that no-fly zone, kicking off a U.S.-Russia war, an escalation to a world war or a nuclear war. This is something that points to a very important issue, which is the fact that our political leaders are not operating with a military mindset. This is something that I and other young officers learned very early on in the military, which is before you go out and execute a certain course of action, you've got to look at what are the consequences. How will your enemy or other actors react to that course of action? And once they react, what will your response to that be? And then what will their response to that be? And continue to go down layer by layer. So if you look at what's happening in the Middle East now, the mess that we're in today can be pointed directly, starting with the Bush administration and continuing to today, with that lack of military mindset, that lack of foresight, whether you're talking about overthrowing Saddam in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, the Arab Spring, Mubarak in Egypt, and now Assad in Syria.
President Obama told NPR that, in his view, the biggest problem in the ISIS fight is not the strategy itself. He says it's that his administration could be communicating better what they're doing, and that we in the media are over-covering the terrorist attacks. Do you agree? Are those the main problems in the fight against ISIS?
I respectfully but completely disagree. This is not a so-called communication problem or issue. There is far more that we should be doing. There should be adjustments and corrections made to this strategy so that we're actually focusing on defeating and destroying our enemy, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these other Islamic extremist groups. I keep pointing back to Syria because it makes no sense how on the one hand we can be, the United States can be waging war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, which is exactly what ISIS wants, so that they can take over all of Syria, and on the other hand say that we're fighting and trying to destroy ISIS. You can't be doing two things at the same time that are completely opposed to each other.
If you look at the different countries, Iraq, Syria, Libya, if you look at these different countries where these Islamic extremist groups have taken hold, the strategy may differ slightly in each of these different areas, and we've got to look at what exactly works. But the problem that I've seen so far is there doesn't appear to be that mission focus. Instead, in Syria, for example, the current policy is counterproductive because on the one hand, the United States is waging a war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, which I believe is illegal because Congress hasn't declared that war. And it's counterproductive because it's working and helping to achieve the exact same objective that ISIS and Al-Qaeda want. They'd love to see this government overthrown so that they can step in, take over all of Syria, creating an even worse humanitarian crisis and presenting a greater threat to the world. We should end that illegal war and focus on the war to defeat and destroy ISIS.
Well, first of all, I am resigning from the DNC so that I can support Bernie Sanders for president. I'd like to tell you why. As a veteran and as a soldier, I've seen firsthand the true cost of war. I served in a medical unit during my first deployment, where every single day I saw firsthand the very high human cost of that war. I see it in my friends who now, a decade after we've come home, are still struggling to get out of a black hole. I think it's most important for us as we look at our choices as to who our next commander-in-chief will be, is to recognize the necessity to have a commander-in-chief who has foresight, who exercises good judgment, who looks beyond the consequences, who looks at the consequences of the actions that they are looking to take before they take those actions, so that we don't continue to find ourselves in these failures that have resulted in chaos in the Middle East, and so much loss of life.
We're back with Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. She just resigned her post as a vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. She's endorsing Senator Bernie Sanders for president of the United States. Congresswoman, why now after that crushing loss in South Carolina? What motivated you to do it now? Because some people think it might be too late.
Well, you know, there's a clear choice, Wolf, between our two Democratic candidates. Our most important quality in our president is their job as a commander-in-chief. As a soldier and as a war veteran, I know firsthand the cost of war. In my deployment to Iraq, I worked in a medical unit where every single day I saw and experienced that high human cost every single day. Bernie Sanders has good judgment and foresight to be able to make decisions about where America should deploy its military power and where it shouldn't deploy its military power. We see a clear contrast with that with Hillary Clinton, who has shown through her record her interventionist wars of regime change. Start with Iraq. She voted for and championed the overthrow of Saddam and the war in Iraq. I did serve in Iraq, and I saw the cost of that overseas, and we're still experiencing the cost of that economically here at home. Number two, Libya. She was the chief architect within the Obama administration to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. What's the result? We see a failed state, we see chaos, human suffering, loss of life, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda having a very strong stronghold there in Libya. Number three, Syria. She has been a champion for and a strong advocate for the overthrow of the Syrian government of Assad and promises to escalate that war with a so-called no-fly zone if she's elected president. So you don't have
confidence that she would be a good commander-in-chief?
Her judgment is the issue, and as a soldier and a veteran, I do not have confidence in her ability to be a commander-in-chief because she would, as she has stated, continue to take us into these interventionist wars of regime change that have cost our country dearly in trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives lost, what to speak of the hundreds of thousands of lives lost in the Middle East.
What's Bernie Sanders' biggest accomplishment from your perspective?
Well, when we're talking about the issues of war and peace, I can speak very specifically, obviously, to his vote against the Iraq War, which is the greatest failure in foreign policy in my generation. And looking forward now, he's been very vocal in speaking out against these interventionist wars of regime change because he understands what the cost is and the necessity to have foresight, to have this military mindset where you look beyond and answer the question, what happens next? What are the consequences of these actions? And we have to know that before we take those actions. And that's the most important thing that we need in our commander-in-chief.
How hard was it for you as a woman to say, you know what, I'm not going to support, at least at this point, the first woman president of the United States?
Well, you know, there are so many different issues in this particular one, the issue of war and peace. It's not just like all the rest. War is very real. War is the issue that we should be asking about in these candidates who are asking to be our commander-in-chief. Because the cost is not only on our troops, on our military families, and those who are sacrificing their lives. The cost is here at home with our economy and with our ability to execute these important domestic programs and policies to rebuild our nation here at home. So when you look at this question of war and peace, there is such a clear difference between these two candidates. The choice was very obvious for me to be able to support and endorse Bernie Sanders.
Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who's on with Rachel Maddow last night, explained why she stepped down as vice chair of the Democratic National Committee to support Bernie Sanders.
It came to a point where I had to see where can I be most effective because there is so much at stake in this election. I'm endorsing Bernie Sanders because he has that sound judgment and that foresight and that commitment to stopping these interventionist wars of regime change. And there's a very clear difference there between him and Secretary Clinton.
I'm joined now by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, chair of the Democratic National Committee. The Gabbard resignation and endorsement of Bernie Sanders on foreign policy grounds against a former Secretary of State came on a day when there was the beginning of a two-part, very in-depth series leading the New York Times exposing the problems in Hillary Clinton's advocacy to intervene in Libya and how she persuaded the president to basically take out Gaddafi, and what we now are seeing is a failed state as a result. Plus the email releases that came last night, the last bunch of more than 3,000 pages. What about her vulnerability on foreign policy?
Well, Andrea, I know you are aware that, I'm not in a position to be able to comment or analyze the prospects for either one of our candidates. My function as the chair is to neutrally manage the primary, and, the Congresswoman decided rightfully that if she was no longer able to follow our rules and be neutral, that it was appropriate for her to step down, and that certainly was her right to do so.
Is there a place in the Democratic Party structure for someone who is a young congresswoman, a veteran from Hawaii, who represents a whole new voice in the Democratic Party, and here she's really either been shut out or feels that she has no role to play?
Well, that's not true at all, and she certainly was and continues to be welcome.
Congresswoman, you were a member of the DNC committee and you recently resigned and endorsed Sanders. Why now, and why did you leave?
As vice chair of the DNC, all DNC officers are supposed to remain neutral in our Democratic primaries, obviously including our presidential primary. And I just got to a point where as a soldier, as a war veteran, I was so frustrated that the most important issue, in my view, the question of war and peace and what qualities we're looking for in our next commander-in-chief were simply not being addressed. I felt that I could no longer stand on the sidelines, and I needed to get in and to speak out, not only for myself. I saw the cost of war firsthand during my first deployment, which was to Iraq. I worked in a medical unit, but for all of my brothers and sisters and for the American people, to point out the differences between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton on this issue of war and peace, on which candidate I feel would take us down a path towards peace, as opposed to Hillary Clinton, who has shown through her record and her current positions that she will continue to take us down this road of interventionist regime change wars that have cost us far too much.
What about any retaliation? The Clintons have had a well-oiled machine in Washington for years. Do you fear any retribution from the Clintons, and what's your relationship been like with her?
Well, I was heavily warned by people who care about me to not endorse Senator Sanders because of that fear of retaliation. And look, that fear is something that exists in a lot of folks that I've heard from. There is far too much at stake here to stand on the sideline and let politics get in the way of what's real. And what's real is war and the cost of war. I've seen and felt that cost firsthand through my service and my deployments to the Middle East, and I cannot stand on the sidelines and do nothing. When we have a clear choice that many people are not informed about, there are very stark differences between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that people know what those differences are so they can at least make an educated and informed decision. It's important for the American people, for us to make a distinction between experience and judgment. And I'll tell you, as a soldier, what I look for as I'm examining who should be our next commander-in-chief is someone who exercises good judgment, someone who has foresight, and someone who has this military mindset, which means you take a look at a specific military course of action, and you analyze it carefully to really look at what will the consequences of that course of action be? How will our enemies react to that? What will our reaction to that be? And go through this process so we know exactly how things are likely to play out before that action is taken.
Please welcome Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii.
My fellow Democrats, my fellow Americans, aloha. Now, on behalf of millions inspired by aloha, determined to seek a future rooted in love, compassion, and justice for all, and dedicated to a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I am truly honored to nominate Bernie Sanders for President of the United States.
Representative Gabbard has sponsored a bill she says will bar the United States from supplying weapons to ISIS or other terror groups. And she joins us now on set. Congresswoman, thanks a lot for coming on. Thank you very much, Tucker. So I was just really struck by that. You were one of the very first people he met with. Now, you issued a press release, and I'm sure some of you're a liberal Democrat, I think it's fair to say. Some of your constituents must have been confused. And you issued this statement. You said, I felt it was important to take the opportunity to meet with the president-elect now before the drumbeats of war that neocons have been beating drag us into an escalation of the war to overthrow the Syrian government. That's right. What did you mean by that, I guess, beyond what you said? And do you believe that the president-elect agrees with your views on this? I have long been outspoken about the devastating problems with our U.S. policy, generally on interventionist wars, and very specifically on the need to end our counterproductive regime change war to overthrow the Syrian government. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, millions of refugees, and the counterproductive result of this has been that these groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups who we proclaim to be our enemy have ended up growing stronger. So understanding that we have a new commander-in-chief coming in, president-elect coming into office very soon, I took the opportunity to be able to get across this message to him. As a veteran, knowing and seeing firsthand the cost of war, I felt it was critical to do my part to try to help influence this new administration and extend this call to action to them to end this counterproductive war that has caused so much devastation. This is an area that is not partisan. This is an issue that both Democrats and Republicans should get behind to stop arming terrorists, to stop this action that has not only caused devastation, but again, it has resulted both directly and indirectly strengthening those whom we are supposed to be trying to defeat. Right. And this is the problem, Tucker, is that there's a double standard here. That for years now, our government, working with countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, have been through the CIA, quietly been arming and supporting these groups that are directly working with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, all in this effort to overthrow the Syrian government. They've been funneling support through countries like Saudi Arabia and others who are also, again, directly supporting these groups. This is madness that this has been allowed to occur for so long, and madness that we have allowed the devastating consequences to occur as a result without checking it. And that's exactly what my bill does. The Stop Arming Terrorists Act very simply prohibits using American taxpayer dollars through any agency, overt or covert, whether it be the CIA, the DOD, or any other agency, from directly or indirectly providing weapons, money, intelligence, or other types of support to these groups that are allied with and working with groups like Al-Qaeda, as is happening right now today in Syria.
Joining me now in a CNN exclusive is Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. She just returned from a secret trip to Syria. Congresswoman Gabbard, thanks for coming and sharing your story with us.
Aloha, Jake. Good to be with you.
So you were in Syria for 4 days. Did you meet with President Bashar al-Assad?
I did. You know, my reason for going to visit Syria was really because of the suffering of the Syrian people that has been weighing heavily on my heart. I wanted to see if there was, in some small way, a way that I could express the love and the aloha and the care that the American people have for the people of Syria, and to see firsthand what was happening there, to see that situation there.
What did Assad have to say?
Initially, I hadn't planned on meeting him. When the opportunity arose to meet with him, I did so because I felt it's important that if we profess to truly care about the Syrian people, about their suffering, then we've got to be able to meet with anyone that we need to if there is a possibility that we could achieve peace. And that's exactly what we talked about. Whatever you think about President Assad, the fact is that he is the president of Syria. In order for any peace agreement, in order for any possibility of a viable peace agreement to occur,
there has to be a conversation with him. The Syrian people will determine his outcome and what happens with their government and their future. But our focus, my commitment is on ending this war that has caused so much suffering to these Syrian people, to these children, to these families, many of whom I met on this trip. It's important for us to stay focused on doing what is in their best interest and what is in our best interest, and doing what it is necessary to make that happen. I'll tell you what I heard from the Syrian people that I met with, Jake, walking down the streets in Aleppo, in Damascus, hearing from them. They expressed happiness and joy at seeing an American walking through their streets, but they expressed a question. They said, why is it that the United States, its allies and other countries are providing support, are providing arms to terrorist groups like al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, Arar al-Sham, ISIS, who are on the ground there raping, kidnapping, torturing, and killing the Syrian people, children, men, women, people of all ages. They asked me, why is the United States and its allies supporting these terrorist groups who are destroying Syria when it was al-Qaeda who attacked the United States on 9/11, not Syria? I didn't have an answer for them.
Obviously, the United States government denies providing any sort of help to the terrorist groups that you're talking about. They say they provide help for the rebel groups. Tell us more about...
The reality is, Jake, the reality is, and I'm glad you brought up that point, because this is an often talked about thing by people like Adam Kinzinger and others saying, well, we've got to support the moderate rebels. Every place that I went, every person that I spoke to, I asked this question to them. And without hesitation, they said, there are no moderate rebels. Who are these moderate rebels that people keep speaking of? Regardless of the name of these groups, the strongest fighting force on the ground in Syria is al-Nusra or al-Qaeda and ISIS. That is a fact. There's a number of different other groups. All of them essentially are fighting alongside, with, or under the command of the strongest group on the ground that's trying to overthrow Assad. The Syrian people recognize, and they know, that if President Assad is overthrown, then al-Qaeda or a group like al-Qaeda that has been killing Christians, killing people simply because of their religion or because they won't support their terror activities, they will take charge of all of Syria. This is the reality that the people of Syria are facing on the ground, and why they are pleading with us here in the United States to stop supporting these terrorist groups. Well, last time I checked, Wolf, Congress had the authority and the responsibility for declaring war, for authorizing the use of military force. So whether the president or the Pentagon or the Secretary of State says that they have the evidence, the fact remains that they have not brought that evidence before Congress. They have not brought that evidence before the American people, and they have not sought authorization from Congress to launch this military attack on another country. The fact is that the United States has been waging this war, this regime change war now for years, covertly through the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government. The result of this has been the suffering of the Syrian people, hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of refugees, and the strengthening of terrorist groups in Syria, like al-Qaeda and ISIS, whose goal is to overthrow the Syrian government. So this escalation that President Trump took yesterday in launching this military attack continues this illegal, unconstitutional war. Well, Wolf, I remind you about what happened before we launched an invasion and occupation of Iraq. Then Colin Powell and many others within the administration came to Congress and came to the UN claiming they had the evidence proving that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We launched a completely destructive, counterproductive war based on that intelligence, which has now, years later, proven to be wrong. We had leaders in Congress then who questioned that evidence that was presented and voted against that war because they were not convinced by the administration then, saying that they had the proof necessary to launch this war. So yes, I'm skeptical because we have to take at a premium the cost of these wars, not only on the Syrian people and the people in the Middle East, but the cost of these wars here in the United States at a time where, you know, we don't have money to build the roads that we need here in Hawaii or in other parts of the country. Why should we just blindly follow this escalation of a counterproductive regime change war, sending American taxpayer dollars on these failed regime change wars that we've seen too often in Iraq, in Libya, and now continuing in Syria? Well, once again, Wolf, all I'm saying is that we have an executive branch of government and a legislative branch of government, and we need to see the evidence. Congress and the American people need to see and analyze this evidence and then make a decision based on that whether or not an authorization of U.S. military force is necessary. And what I'm telling you is that that hasn't happened. Again, this isn't about what I believe or what I doubt. What matters the most here are the facts. The American people deserve to see and know of the evidence and the facts before authorizing the continuation of this destructive, counterproductive, illegal regime change war. Our interest, Wolf, must be on bringing about peace. That if we truly care and are compassionate for the Syrian people, these children and women and innocent people who are being most impacted by this war, we need to end this destructive regime change war, not escalate it as the president has just done through his illegal military strike launched last night. You know, I went to Syria in the interest of furthering the cause of peace, to see and hear firsthand from the Syrian people how we can bring about an end to this counterproductive regime change war, something that I have been fighting for now as a member of Congress for years. Whether we like it or not, President Assad remains the president of Syria. And in order to determine a negotiated outcome to end this regime change war that, again, has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of refugees, he has a part to play in bringing about that negotiated outcome. We should not continue this counterproductive regime change war, to overthrow the Syrian government, first and foremost because it will be destructive to the Syrian people, just like we saw our wars in Iraq and Libya turned out to be worse off for the people of those countries. And just like in those two countries, we're already seeing this war we've been waging for years has only proven to strengthen these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and like ISIS, who are trying to overthrow the government so that they can walk in and fill that vacuum and take over all of Syria for their own nefarious means. I'm interested in finding the solution, and the solution is to end this counterproductive regime change war. The United States has been waging, along with allies, so-called allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, all seeking to overthrow the Syrian government. We have been providing arms, funding, salary, support, intelligence, and other types of both direct and indirect support to armed militants within Syria who are working directly with Al-Qaeda, who are allied with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda towards this end of overthrowing the Syrian government. All an action which has resulted in more chaos and suffering for the Syrian people, as well as counterproductive to our American national security interests by strengthening the very enemy that attacked us on 9/11. It makes no sense, and I've spoken to you before about my bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists bill, that would put an end to this madness by prohibiting American taxpayer dollars from paying for this support, for paying for this counterproductive regime change war. You know, Wolf, I've never made decisions based on fear of what might people think or what might be politically advantageous for me. As a veteran, I have seen the cost of these wars, experienced them firsthand, seen the human cost in friends of mine who did not come home from the war in Iraq. I went to Congress promising my constituents, my fellow veterans and brothers and sisters in uniform that I would do all I could to prevent our country from making these kinds of disastrous and destructive mistakes again in the future. I went to Syria with the focus and mission on peace, how we can bring about an end to this destructive regime change war, and I'm continuing that fight today. This is the problem, is, you know, the Syrian people have been crying out for peace for so long, and the media completely is missing the point here about what is being reported, that Trump is ending this CIA program, as you described, But for the benefit of your viewers, let's talk about what the CIA program actually was. It's been widely reported that for years now, the CIA was providing arms, intelligence, money, and other types of support to these armed militants who were working hand in hand and who are working hand in hand, and oftentimes under the command of Al-Qaeda in Syria. So this isn't a matter of like we're giving weapons to people, but they end up falling in the wrong hands. We are directly arming armed militants who are working under the command of Al-Qaeda, all in this effort to overthrow the Syrian government. It is this addiction to regime change and this idea that somehow this is what must be done, again, without actually looking at the fact that we have been providing direct and indirect support to Al-Qaeda, this very same terrorist group that attacked us on 9/11 and that we are supposed to be continuing to be fighting against and trying to defeat. And the thing that should make everyone feel sick is that people would rather support directly and indirectly Al-Qaeda than actually give up their regime change goals. Look, for years, even through the Obama administration, I've been advocating to bring about an end to this program, and I'm continuing, actually, through the introduction of my bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, to make sure that our government does not use taxpayer dollars to provide this kind of support, whether it's weapons, intelligence, or money, or anything else, directly or indirectly to these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. And the reason why this is so important is because while reports are saying that the Trump administration has ended this CIA program, it could very easily be changed and reinstated in a month or 6 months, or it could rear its ugly head again in another country, but also because our so-called allies in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, and these other countries, they are continuing to provide direct and indirect support to these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. And my bill would bring about an end to this. The people who are suffering are people in countries like Syria, people in countries like Yemen who are suffering as a result of our policies. And they have been directly counterproductive to our own national security. How we could allow the use of American taxpayer dollars to strengthen Al-Qaeda is beyond me. And that's what I'm fighting to stop. We've been given no information that there have been any direct talks, what to speak of, between President Trump and Kim Jong-un or other members of his administration. This is something that I've been advocating for a long time. Wolf, you and I have talked about the threat that the people of Hawaii feel from North Korea, given we fall squarely within the range of their intercontinental ballistic missiles. Hawaii has recently started these nuclear alarm tests every month. So this is a very real threat. I've been calling for direct negotiations without preconditions between the United States and North Korea, Trump and Kim Jong-un, to begin to de-escalate and ultimately denuclearize the North Korean peninsula, because we don't have time to waste.
That was a scene of panic in Hawaii yesterday after the state emergency system sent out this alert to mobile phones statewide. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. But that was a false alarm. Someone pushed the wrong button. There was no missile threat. It took a full 38 minutes for the state to issue a civil emergency message retracting the false alert. Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard joins us now. And Congresswoman, thank you for joining us this morning. As I just said, 38 minutes for the state to retract that false alarm. It only took you 12. You actually issued this tweet. Want to put it up on the board right there. Hawaii, this is a false alarm. There is no incoming missile to Hawaii. I have confirmed with officials there is no incoming missile. How did you get the truth? Walk us through what happened.
Well, you can only imagine, George, the panic, the terror, the chaos and confusion that ensued when over 1 million people in Hawaii, plus many visitors who are visiting Hawaii, got that alert on their cell phones, now understanding that they literally just have minutes, taking this threat seriously. They've got minutes to say goodbye to their loved ones, to find their loved ones, to try to find some kind of shelter somewhere, which there are no designated nuclear bomb shelters in Hawaii. I went through that same thing when I got that message on my phone, wondering where my family is, what they were doing. I immediately called Hawaii officials and civil defense, asked them what's going on here, and was told right away that there's no incoming missile threat. Someone pushed the wrong button. It
so
was
why
an
did it take so
inadvertent
long for
mistake.
them to retract it?
Well, that's what we're still trying to get to the bottom of. It's absolutely unacceptable, and it's an epic failure of leadership. Yes, it was unacceptable that this went out in the first place, but the fact that it took so long for them to put out that second message to calm people, to allay their fears that this was a mistake, a false alarm, is something that has to be fixed, corrected, with people held accountable. You know, I got messages from people all across Hawaii throughout the day yesterday just detailing what they went through. You know, a father sent me a message saying that his two children were in two different locations, and he had to sit there and think which of his children he was going to choose to spend the last minutes of his life with. There were so many people who went through this stark reality that I hope the rest of the country, that I hope people in Washington, leaders in Washington, pay attention to, that this threat of nuclear war, nuclear attack, is not a game. This is real. And this is what the people of Hawaii just went through yesterday morning.
Do you believe that President Trump should be speaking directly to the leader of North Korea?
Absolutely, and immediately. This is something that I've been calling for a long time. I've been talking about the seriousness of this threat posed to the people of Hawaii and this country coming from North Korea. The people of Hawaii are paying the price now for decades of failed leadership in this country, of failure to directly negotiate, to prevent us from getting to this point where we're dealing with this threat today, setting unrealistic preconditions. And I've been calling for President Trump to sit across the table from Kim Jong-un without preconditions, work out the differences, figure out a way to build this pathway towards denuclearization, because there is so much at stake. The people of Hawaii recognized this yesterday, experienced it personally. The leaders of this country need to experience that same visceral understanding of how lives are at stake. But I think it's also important, as we talk about how important it is that Trump directly negotiates with North Korea, we've got to understand why Kim Jong-un is saying he's not going to give up his nuclear weapons. Our country's history of regime change wars has led countries like North Korea to develop and hold on to these nuclear weapons because they see it as their only deterrent against regime change. And this is what's important for President Trump to recognize. It is critical that we end our policies of regime change wars to provide that credible guarantee that the United States is not going to go in and topple the North Korean regime so that these conversations can begin towards denuclearization. And we know that North Korea has these nuclear weapons because they see how the United States in Libya, for example, guaranteed Gaddafi, we're not going to go after you, you should get rid of your nuclear weapons. He did. Then we went and led an attack that toppled Gaddafi, launching Libya into chaos that we are still seeing the results of today. North Korea sees what we did in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, with those false reports of weapons of mass destruction, and now seeing in Iran how President Trump is decertifying a nuclear deal that prevented Iran from developing their nuclear weapons, threatening the very existence in the agreement that was made. So yes, we've got to understand North Korea is holding on to these nuclear weapons because they think it is their only protection from the United States coming in and doing to them what the United States has done to so many countries throughout history.
Was it a mistake for the United States to take out Gaddafi and Hussein?
It was, absolutely. We've got to get to the underlying issue here of why are the people of Hawaii in this country facing a nuclear threat coming from North Korea today, and what is this president doing urgently to eliminate that threat?
Now, you've said that he's taking too long to deal with this, and he's not taking the threat from North Korea seriously. What do you want President Trump to be doing?
Well, I've been talking about the seriousness of this threat for years, since I came here to Congress, and I've been calling on President Trump to directly negotiate with North Korea, to sit across the table from Kim Jong-un, work out the differences so that we can build a pathway towards denuclearization, to remove this threat. There's a few things that have to happen in order for those negotiations to be successful. First of all, they have to happen without preconditions. And this has been a learned lesson from the decades of failed leadership that the people of Hawaii are paying the price for now, where they set these unrealistic preconditions. For example, saying, North Korea, we're only going to talk to you if you first get rid of your nuclear weapons. What would be the point of having a conversation
if they get rid of their nuclear weapons. There'd be nothing to talk about at that point. But the second issue is understanding why North Korea has developed and is holding on so tightly to these nuclear weapons, because they see it as the only deterrent against the U.S. coming in and overthrowing the regime there. So that exists as a result, again, of our decades-long regime change war policies around the world, that North Korea is now in a position where Kim Jong-un is saying, no way, I'm not going to give up these nuclear weapons, because he doesn't see that credible message coming from the United States that we're not interested in overthrowing your government. We're interested in removing this nuclear threat from our country and the world. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. You know, the president has indicated recently his intention to launch U.S. military attacks against Syria. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. Congress has not done so against the Syrian government. My question is, will the president uphold the Constitution, the War Powers Resolution, and comply with the law that he signed by obtaining authorization from Congress before launching U.S. military attacks against Syria?
Congresswoman, we have not yet made any decision to launch military attacks into Syria. This is a complex area, I'll be the first to admit.
It is simple, however, what the Constitution requires. So while you're correct in saying the president has not yet made a decision, my question is, will he abide by the Constitution and comply with the law?
I believe that the president will carry out his duties under the Constitution to protect the country.
What would the objective of an attack on Syria be, and how does that serve the interests of the American people?
I don't want to talk about a specific attack that is not yet in the offing.
So if the decision is made, as you have stated publicly, you're laying all the options on the table for the president. If the decision is made to launch a military attack against Syria, Russia has already responded, saying that they would respond to our U.S. strike. As this action is considered, can you justify for the American people how going to war with Russia over Syria serves the interests of the American people?
No, Congresswoman, I can't answer that question. I'm not ready to speculate that would happen.
Would you not say that it is a highly likely occurrence given what Russia has stated directly, that they will respond?
No, Congresswoman, I would not.
One last question. The 2001 AUMF is the authorization with which our U.S. forces are in Syria today. While there's been much progress made in the counter-ISIS campaign, and they're close to being defeated in Syria, Al-Qaeda has grown stronger. Brett McGurk stated just over a year ago that al-Nusra is now Al-Qaeda's largest formal affiliate in history. So Al-Qaeda has grown stronger in Syria. Why is this, and why have our U.S. policies not gone after Al-Qaeda in Syria?
Well, our policy is in Syria, which is a very complex battle space, Congresswoman, that where they're located right now, we do not want to go up into another part of Syria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 days ago, President Trump and Vice President Pence delivered solemn speeches about the attacks on 9/11, talking about how much they care about the victims of Al-Qaeda's attack on our country. But they're now standing up to protect the 20,000 to 40,000 Al-Qaeda and other jihadist forces in Syria, threatening Russia, Syria, and Iran with military force if they dare attack these terrorists. This is a betrayal of the American people, especially the victims of Al-Qaeda's attack on 9/11 and their families, first responders, and to my brothers and sisters in uniform who have been killed or wounded in action, and their families. For the President, who's Commander-in-Chief, to act as the protective big brother of Al-Qaeda and other jihadists must be condemned by every member of Congress.
U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard is calling on Congress to stop supporting Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. She calls it genocidal, with tens of thousands of civilians killed and millions facing starvation and disease. Gabbard's pushing a bipartisan measure to block U.S. military sales to the Saudis, but Republicans blocked the measure.
Now, don't be fooled. If Congress and this administration truly were concerned about the plight of the Yemeni people and peace, all
U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's atrocities would end now. Instead, last night on the Rules Committee, Republicans voted to shut down debate.
Why are they doing
the
this?
biggest BS that I see in this whole thing is this statement that you hear from President Trump, you hear it from Mike Pompeo, you hear it from different people within this administration, that Saudi Arabia is a good ally or is our best ally or our best friend within the region. The issue here with the murdering of this journalist in Turkey shines a light on the larger question that I think needs to be asked and answered here in Washington, which is, show the evidence of how Saudi Arabia is our ally, because I can tell you there is a long list of reasons pointing to all of the reasons why they are not our allies, why they are acting directly in ways that are counterproductive to the interests of the American people and to our own national security interests. When you look at the things that this administration is doing, they are things that are moving us farther and farther away from the possibility of striking a peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Again, we've got to look at what's driving this. And if you look at Trump, and he's made it very clear, it's money, and it's his so-called deal with the Saudis for this $110 billion of weapons that he's selling to them without regard for how they're using those weapons and slaughtering people in Yemen. There are so many issues here that really.
You don't think we should have to deal with the fact that the Saudi royal family is there to stay? There's nothing we can do about it.
That's not the point. I'm not saying that we've got to get rid of the Saudi state or the government or whatever. That is not my point at all. I don't believe that we should be in the regime change business, whether it be in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, or North Korea, or Syria, or anywhere else.
Trump ran by saying he was going to get rid of stupid wars and help the troops. Where'd you put him on that? Where's he doing on that?
Moving us in the wrong direction. Not only have we not ended any of these stupid wars, we are continuing to have our troops deployed in places like Afghanistan and Syria and other places, all while this administration is laying the groundwork for a regime change war against Iran. What to speak of the veterans here at home. I spoke with a veteran recently who used to work in the VA and who now works just helping veterans in his community, who said, and he was a Republican, and he said never before has he seen veterans worse off with this VA than he has with this VA. And that's because veterans are being treated like a number. And so in order to report out good statistics, their cases are being closed prematurely. We're seeing cases and appointments being deleted completely because they were waiting too long. And this GI Bill issue, where veterans are trying to go to school, they've been promised these benefits, and the VA is saying, well, actually, we'll pay you in a year and a half. Meanwhile, they've got to pay their rent, they've got to pay their tuition and take care of their families.
And our dad went to school on the GI Bill.
Yeah, so did I.
That's why we're middle class. Anyway, 2020, the Baskin-Robbins campaign. There's every kind of flavor running. Somebody from Hawaii was recently elected president, Barack Obama. Yourself, are you running?
I'm seriously considering it.
What would stop you?
I'm concerned about the direction of our country.
No, what would stop you from running?
I don't know. I'm thinking through
Sounds
very
like you're
carefully.
heading toward it.
I'm thinking
That's
through
an
it
old
very
Tim Russert question, by the way. What would stop you? You have to come up with that answer. It's good to have you. A lot of people are seeing you for the first time. U.S. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard may run for president in a very wide, interesting field.
We're back with our experts, and Rebecca, Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii has just told our Van Jones she will run for president of the United States. Listen to this.
Are you going to run for president of the United States and do something about it? Do you think you should? Do you think you should? Are you going to run?
I have decided to run and will be making a formal announcement within the next week.
Whoa.
She is the first female combat veteran to run for president. Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard served 2 tours of duty in the Middle East before being elected to Congress in 2012. And she joins me now at the table. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Good afternoon. The most important job that a president has is to serve as commander-in-chief, to keep the American people and our country safe and secure. And so the experience that I bring of serving as a soldier for over 16 years,
of deploying twice to the Middle East and serving in Congress now for over 6 years on both the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs committees have brought me that experience and understanding about the issues that face our country and our national security and the cost of war, so that I can walk in on day one to do that job as President and Commander-in-Chief. There are many different issues that we face here domestically, and you'll hear a lot of the other candidates talking about that. But what is often not addressed is the fact that our foreign policy, the cost of these continued wasteful regime change wars that we've been waging now for so long, has a direct connection to our domestic policy and our ability to invest the resources that we need to in things like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and so on.
Well, let me just quickly ask you about a couple things. Iran, right now there's a lot of attention being paid to whether the Trump administration is edging closer to some sort of military confrontation with Iran. What would you be doing differently?
A number of things. I think first it's important to make sure the American people understand that a war with Iran would be far more costly and far more devastating than anything that we experienced in Iraq. What we would see is a devastating cost on our troops, my brothers and sisters in uniform, a cost on the civilians, people both in Iran and across the region, worse refugee crisis across Europe, as well as a strengthening of terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, further undermining our national security. So it would essentially make the war in Iraq look like a cakewalk when we look at the cost of going to war with Iran.
So you wouldn't have pulled out of the nuclear deal?
I would not have pulled out of the nuclear deal. I think Trump needs to recognize that his strategy thus far has been counterproductive and has been a failure. As president, I would re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, negotiate with Iran separately on the other issues that we have, and find a diplomatic way to de-escalate these tensions that we have.
Let me ask you about Syria. You were criticized by a number of Democrats 2 years ago when you met with Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad. As you know, he is seen as a brutal dictator, overseeing the torture, the killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians in that country. If you're elected president, would you sit down with Bashar al-Assad again? What do you think it would accomplish?
I think it's important for the sake of our country's national security to keep the American people safe and the pursuit of peace, for our president and commander-in-chief to have the courage to meet with leaders of other countries, whether they be adversaries or potential adversaries, in order to achieve that peace and security. I think it's important now for Trump to meet with the Iranian president so that we don't face this situation as we are now, where we are walking dangerously closer and closer to war with Iran. Unless we are serious and have the courage to hold these conversations and have these meetings, the only alternative is war.
Russia, would you be tougher on Russia than this administration or not? You've talked about the importance of avoiding any sort of nuclear confrontation with Russia, which obviously everybody wants, but what would you do differently?
Well, as we look at this threat of nuclear war and a nuclear catastrophe, nuclear strategists say we are closer to potential of a nuclear war now than ever before. So it's important for us to make sure that we are de-escalating tensions with nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China, and build those relationships that are based more on cooperation rather than conflict. Deal with the issues that we have, but also recognize in situations like North Korea and our goal of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, it is in our best interest to be able to work with countries like Russia and China to achieve that goal.
I mean, I'm really not going to take sides in this. There are no candidates, with one exception, that I really don't think should be president.
And who's that exception?
Tulsi Gabbard. I don't think she knows what she's doing, and I don't think she should be qualified, and she's not qualified.
And what's that based on?
About her dalliances with Assad, her statements about gay people. It's just, I don't know what she thinks she's doing.
So who's in right now? So we have Kamala, Kirsten
Tulsi
Gillibrand. Oh, monstrous.
Monstrous?
Ideas.
Well, when she was 22, she had...
No, she's an Assad toady.
What does that mean?
She is
What's a toady?
I think that I used that word correctly. Jamie, can you check what toady means?
Like toeing the line? Is that what it means?
No, I think it's like a... Toadie.
What does that mean?
I think it means what I think it means.
Toady. Definition of toadies. A person who flatters or defers to others for self-serving reasons.
A sycophant.
So she's an Assad sycophant. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's known about her.
Like, what did she say that
We have to look.
qualifies her?
I don't remember the details.
We
I've read
probably
it.
should say that before we say that about her. We should probably read it rather.
Well, I have read it.
No, I mean, we should right now.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Just so we know what she said.
Look up
I've had her
Tulsi
on
Gabbard.
here before.
Look
and
up
I really enjoyed talking to her. I like her a lot.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I like talking to her.
Okay.
I like talking to her. I don't know about.
I think she's like the mother lode of bad ideas.
Whoa.
I'm pretty positive about that, especially on Assad. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I'm wrong.
Well, my take on her was that I think as a person who's coming from the left, who's also a veteran and is very articulate and sensible and a woman, and in talking to her, we didn't get into Assad or any of those things, but talking to her about what she feels is wrong with the current administration and the way things are running and a direction she thinks things could go in. She had some very promising ideas. I didn't know about this.
But doesn't she also, did she ever apologize for believing in conversion therapy?
I didn't even know she believed in conversion therapy.
Am I crazy?
Is that real?
I'm almost positive this is real. I think her father ran
when you say conversion therapy, you're talking about gay people.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I didn't know that. I never heard that. I did hear something about when she was very young. She was like 22. She had said something about gay marriage and civil unions that she apologized for and said that she evolved. She reveals she met Assad in Syria without informing top Democrats.
I'm telling you,
She said she went on a fact-finding mission in support of peace for Syrian people, but characterized U.S.-backed rebels as terrorists.
Yeah, hold on.
I can keep looking, but
I'm telling
I don't have
you,
enough time to research everything all at the same time.
I can come back on when I know more.
Okay, but we can do this another time. That's one thing that you have over them for sure, is that you understand from firsthand experience and sacrifice what it means to actually be in war and to be in combat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I still serve in the Army National Guard now over 16 years. I've deployed twice to the Middle East, and coupled with my experience in Congress, serving over 6 years on the Foreign Affairs and the Armed Services Committees, working intimately on these issues related to national security and our foreign policy, meeting with leaders of different countries in the world. It is these experiences and the understanding that I've gained from them that best equip me to walk into the Oval Office on day one, ready to do the job of president and, most importantly, commander-in-chief.
What hurdles are you encountering that you didn't expect?
A lot of what's happening are things that we kind of did expect. The smear campaigns, the misinformation campaigns.
Do you think that someone's doing this on purpose, or do you think this is team mentality in action, where people are supporting a particular candidate and they look at you as being competition of that candidate? Like, what do you think?
I think it's probably a combination. I'm challenging the establishment, challenging the status quo, challenging the foreign policy establishment, and challenging the political establishment in calling things as I see them, calling it straight and speaking the truth, whether that be calling out leaders within my own party or leaders of the other political party. And, I think that strikes fear in a lot of people who are uncomfortable with it at a minimum and who are concerned because when, we the people rise up and say, hey, what's really going on here? We're calling out self-serving politicians in Washington from both political parties who are putting their own political interests or the interests of their party ahead of the interests of the people. Or they're putting the interests of, whatever greedy corporation and their lobbyist is writing the biggest checks to their campaigns ahead of the interests of the people. So the more this awareness comes out, the more people stand up and speak out and say, hey, this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. Then it's threatening that very power base that they have thrived and lived off of for far too long.
We should talk about how you're funded too, just so people understand your position.
Yeah.
So
people-powered campaign. We take
100%.
no PAC contributions, no lobbyist contributions. Every single dollar that comes to my campaign for president is coming from individual people across this country, whether it's $1 or $1,000, people who are giving whatever they can and joining this movement.
If I put my tinfoil hat on when I talk about these interventionist foreign policy wars and regime change wars, the tinfoil hat thinks military industrial complex.
Yeah.
People being asked or forced into making decisions that benefit these giant corporations that make weapons and profit off of war.
Yeah.
This is the worst case scenario in terms of conspiracy theories. The idea that someone wants war so that they can make money and they don't care if people die, even needlessly. This is our number one conspiracy fear, right? If you had to think about of all the things that you hope are not true about the way the world works, that would probably be number one.
Well, you can take your tinfoil hat off because the military-industrial complex is a real thing. This is something that President Eisenhower talked about.
Which is an amazing speech.
Amazing speech. His last speech as President of the United States, of all the things that he could talk about, he chose to focus on the military-industrial complex.
Should we play that right now?
It is.
I feel like we should play that.
Yes,
just because
absolutely.
It's
play
so,
that clip.
It's so crazy, and most people have never heard it before.
What most people don't know is that his first draft of that speech said Congressional Military Industrial Complex.
Whoa.
And somewhere between the draft and the speech that was delivered, he took out that word congressional. But he was directly connecting those dots.
Whoa.
That some may say, oh, well, that's just a conspiracy theory, but he was connecting those dots with the influence that the military-industrial complex has on leaders in Congress who are making decisions about how our money is spent and where our troops are sent off into battle. But you also see this corruption that's happening before our very eyes, happening within places like the Pentagon, where you either have people in uniform or civilians who are working in contracting, for example, in the Pentagon, laying the groundwork for writing up these contracts, major multi-billion-dollar contracts with these big defense contractors, and then lay down the uniform, or you retire from service, either as a civilian or in the military, and then you turn around, leave that door and walk into another door working for the very same contractor that you just wrote the contract for.
Yeah.
This is happening. This is what we need to change when we're talking about both campaign finance reform, but also reforming this kind of corruption and this revolving door that's happening in different parts of our government. You see it happening in Wall Street too.
Yes.
The SEC regulators, people are supposed to be regulating Wall Street, are coming from Wall Street and then going back to Wall Street to work for the very same companies that they were supposedly just charged to regulate. This is a big problem that we've got to fix.
Yeah, there's a fantastic documentary on that called Inside Job. I don't know if did you see it?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
You see when he's confronting these guys who are professors who then go and take these jobs and make millions of dollars with the very regulations that they helped put into place.
That's right.
What could be done to stop that other than someone like you getting into power?
Well,
and what could you do once you get in there?
I think two things. I mean, obviously, as president and commander in chief, you set the tone for the kind of leadership that we have in this country that will put service above self. And this is what I will bring as president. Bring those soldiers' values of putting service above self, putting service to the American people and your country first and foremost, ahead of everything else, ahead of the interests of a political party or a corporation or a foreign country, for that matter. And work to pass legislation in Congress that would close these revolving doors, that would require this transparency when you're talking about who is funding who and where is this money coming from.
What is your take on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange?
What happened with his arrest and all this stuff that just went down, I think poses a great threat to our freedom of the press and to our freedom of speech. We look at what happened under the previous administration, under Obama. You know, they were trying to find ways to go after Assange and WikiLeaks, but ultimately they chose not to seek to extradite him or charge him because they recognized what a slippery slope that begins
when you have a government in a position to levy criminal charges and consequences against someone who's publishing information or saying things that the government doesn't want you to say. The government doesn't, sharing information the government doesn't want you to share. And so the fact that the Trump administration has chosen to ignore that fact, to ignore how important it is that we uphold our freedoms, freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and go after him, it has a very chilling effect on both journalists and publishers. And you can look to both those in the traditional media, but also those in new media, and also on every one of us as American. It was a kind of a warning call saying, look what happened to this guy. It could happen to you. It could happen to any one of us.
He's a guy that got information and released it to the general public that the government wanted to keep private. It's really that simple.
Yeah.
Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
What is your
similar situation? Similar situation. I don't think we. I remember the very day that I woke up in D.C., looked at my phone, started looking through the headlines, and saw those headlines about how the NSA was mass surveilling all of us and collecting our phone records, collecting our cell phone records, and Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and I was shocked. So that was something that Snowden uncovered and released, something that I don't know that even as members of Congress we would have been aware of. But was the NSA going to disclose that information voluntarily on their own? Absolutely not. Absolutely
no, we would
not.
have had no idea.
No.
Snowden was the guy that really made it abundantly clear to everybody that not only are they doing that, but they're also lying about it.
Yeah.
And even Obama was talking, we're just collecting metadata.
Yeah.
Like, metadata? Like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
You're reading messages. You could do anything.
Exactly.
Like, this is just not an accurate assessment of what was going on.
No.
And it was outrageous to people.
And you had, I think he was the director of the Department of National Intelligence at that time, James Clapper, who sat before a committee in the United States Senate and blatantly lied.
Yeah.
He was asked very directly, are you collecting this information? And he said no.
Yeah.
Are you collecting this information on American citizens? And he said no. And yet he's somebody who you see on TV almost every day as an expert in this country without any consequence, lying to the American people.
Got this guy, he's in Russia now hiding.
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy that he
can't
lives
leave.
over there and he can't leave. And if he does come over here, they're immediately going to lock him up.
Yeah.
What would you do as president?
One thing that I think, I want to answer your question, but one thing that I think speaks to the dangerous nature of this culture that we're living in now. The Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer had done an interview on, I don't know, one of the major networks, and I think he was talking about Trump when he said, "Be careful, you don't want to challenge the intelligence agencies." Basically putting out that threat. I don't know if you can pull that exact quote up, but I was shocked when I heard him say that, because it basically makes out that these intelligence agencies are their own separate branch of government, and that if any one of us as Americans or elected leaders in this country dares to challenge or exercise oversight over them, then we will suffer the consequences. So as president, I would change that culture of leadership. That leadership starts at the top. And when you have people in positions of leadership who continue to perpetuate that culture of unaccountability, of complete disrespect and disregard for the Constitution, of not understanding that, yes, we need to keep our country safe, we also need to protect our constitutional rights. This is not a choice between the two, which is so often how it's framed. Well, if you want to protect us against terrorists, you've got to give up all of your rights as Americans and your civil liberties and your privacies, and just let these intelligence agencies run free and run roughshod over us.
What would you do about Julian Assange? What would you do about Edward Snowden?
As far as
what would you do once
dropping the charges?
If you're president of the world right now, what do you do?
Dropping the charges.
So you would give him a pardon?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we've got to address why he did the things the way that he did them.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear the same thing from Chelsea Manning, how there is not an actual channel for whistleblowers like them to bring forward information that exposes egregious abuses of our constitutional rights and liberties, period. I mean, there was not a channel for that to happen in a real way, and that's why they ended up taking the path that they did and suffering the consequences.
Your position on Syria is one that I think people have misconstrued. Why don't you tell me?
That's putting it nicely.
That's trying to put it as nicely as possible.
Yes.
They've actually said that you are an Assad supporter. I know this is not correct.
Yeah.
But is that one of those things where people just say that in order to sort of diffuse you, to categorize you as a ridiculous person right off the bat, where no one could take anything else you say seriously?
Yeah, it's the usual tactic of trying to smear or vilify me and my campaign and what I'm advocating for, because they don't want to engage on the actual issue itself that I'm pointing out about how devastating and costly their policies are of continuing to wage these wasteful regime change wars, of choosing to support terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in Syria, directly in Syria, because they are the most powerful force on the ground who's fighting to take out the regime, Assad's government. So they're so focused on toppling this government in Syria that they're willing to actually use taxpayer dollars to provide direct and indirect support to Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria. When you think about how crazy this is, it makes me angry. I think it makes most people angry. It's why I introduced legislation called the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. Why we would need to have such legislation is beyond me, but clearly we do, to make it so that we don't have any taxpayer dollars going directly to provide any kind of arms or support or anything to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, but also to make it so that we are not providing support indirectly through countries like Saudi Arabia, who are providing that support to terrorist groups. I mean, I'll just tell you what happened. I went to Syria to meet with Syrian people, to hear for myself from them about what was happening there. While there, I was offered the invitation to meet with the president of Syria, and I took it because I think it's important for us to have the courage to meet with leaders, whether they be friends or adversaries or potential adversaries, if our focus is on national security and on peace. So I went and I had that meeting and I asked some tough questions and heard from him his perspective on what was happening and what he was doing in his country, and took the opportunity while there to meet with religious leaders, college students, members of the political opposition, small business owners. It is because of that and that meeting and my staunch opposition to regime change wars in Syria and in other countries that political opponents and others have chosen to try to smear me, my reputation, and my campaign, and to label me, as you said, she's a supporter of this dictator. Well, if that's true, then anyone who opposed the Iraq war is a Saddam Hussein lover, is a lover of dictators and loves Saddam Hussein. So if you challenge their logic, you see how shallow it is, and there's really none there. And what's exposed is their refusal to engage on the facts and to stand behind why they continue to put the American people through these costly regime change wars and why they continue to wage these wars that are causing incredible suffering for people in different parts of the world.
When you choose to distort people's positions like this, you're not helping anybody.
No.
You're making the whole thing more confusing.
Yeah.
So for someone like me who's on the outside and then has to watch all this go down, I have to go, well, why do you have reasonable people that make inaccurate statements about someone because they feel like if you don't refuse a meeting with Assad, there's something wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
Like to not want to be in the presence of this person.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so much hypocrisy around this. A lot of these people are the same people who applauded President Obama when he first ran for president, saying, yes, he would meet with the leader of Iran without preconditions, that he would meet with leaders of other countries in that pursuit of national security and peace.
Yeah.
So why the double standard here that, okay, so in order to keep our country safe, in order to achieve peace, we're only going to meet with our friends and people who we agree with. That's not how you accomplish that mission. That's not how you accomplish security and peace. It doesn't make sense.
No, it's like a social media version of running the world.
Yeah, sadly.
Sadly.
I think that's really what's missing here is, you know, for so long we've seen this imperialistic mentality that still exists in our government, where some feel like, hey, well, we should go and tell this country who should lead their government and tell them what kind of policies they should have. But no other country should dare even attempt to do that to ours. The problems begin when we go into other countries and try to create little mini Americas and impose it on the people there, whether they like it or not, whether they're ready for it or not. And we end up seeing what we're seeing across the Middle East.
Yeah, I think we just look at the rest of the world and go, well, I wouldn't tolerate that.
Yeah.
Why are they tolerating that?
Yeah.
Who is that guy?
Yeah.
Why does he get to run things? They should kick his ass. That's literally the American perspective.
This is something that I realized very quickly during my first deployment to Iraq, where I was seeing firsthand the cost of war, serving in that medical unit every single day. And I wondered how many politicians in Washington who voted for or advocated for or championed that war in Iraq were laying awake at night thinking about my brothers and sisters who were getting killed in combat, who were getting severely wounded, who were getting blown up by IEDs. And I learned very quickly that they were not. They weren't thinking about the real costs and the ramifications and the consequences of their decisions. There were a lot of folks in 2016 who said Hillary Clinton was the most experienced candidate ever to run for president because of the jobs she had held or the experience that she had had. My problem was with her judgment and the kinds of decisions that she would make as commander-in-chief, decisions that would continue to send people like me and my brothers and sisters in uniform to continue to fight in these wasteful regime change wars that actually dishonor the oath that we all take when we volunteer to serve, to protect and defend our country and the American people, and instead sending us on these missions that are counter to that promise, that undermine our national security, that undermine the great sacrifice that our troops and their families make. So it's that judgment, it's the experience and the judgment that I believe we need to look for in the next commander-in-chief. It's what I bring to the table, and it's what I challenge voters to ask the other candidates and to hold them to account on both of those fronts. Would they be ready to walk into that Oval Office on day one and to serve our country as commander-in-chief?
Now to an extraordinary development in the presidential campaign. Hillary Clinton, the 2016 nominee, called Tulsi Gabbard, one of the current candidates, quote, the favorite of the Russians. Nancy Cordes is following this. And Nancy, what are we to make about all this?
Well, Nora, Hillary Clinton did not mention Tulsi Gabbard by name, but an aide confirms that that's who she was talking about when she made this stunning claim that the Russians had already hit on a way to meddle in the 2020 election, much in the same way they meddled in her election in 2016. On a podcast interview, Clinton said, quote, they're grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far. This afternoon, Gabbard lashed back, accusing Clinton of trying to destroy her reputation and calling Clinton, quote, the queen of warmongers, embodiment of corruption and personification of the rot that has sickened the Democratic Party for so long. For now, most other Democrats are staying out of this fight.
Hillary Clinton is suggesting that Russians are grooming a 2020 Democratic presidential hopeful to run as a third-party candidate and spoil the race for the Democrats. Take a listen to her remarks in a new podcast from David Plouffe.
I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far. And that's assuming Jill Stein will give it up, which she might not, because she's also a Russian asset.
Agent,
yeah, she's a Russian asset. I mean, totally.
Now, when asked if Clinton was referring to Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, Democrat of Hawaii, Clinton's spokesman said, quote, if the nesting doll fits. So Gabbard just tweeted a response. Let me read it. She said, quote, great, thank you, Hillary Clinton. You, the queen of warmongers, embodiment of corruption and personification of the rot that has sickened the Democratic Party for so long, have finally come out from behind the curtain. From the day I announced my candidacy, there has been a concerted campaign to destroy my reputation. We wondered who was behind it and why. Now we know it was always you, through your proxies and powerful allies in the corporate media and war machine, afraid of the threat I pose. It's now clear that this primary is between you and me. Don't cowardly hide behind your proxies. Join the race directly.
What did you make of Secretary Clinton's comments this week?
Let's be clear about what this is about. Really, that if anyone stands up and speaks out to end the regime change war policies our country has had for so long, the likes of which we've seen waged in Iraq, Libya, and ongoing in Syria, we will be labeled as foreign agents. We will be labeled as traitors to our country. So really what this is a message to every veteran in this country who has put their life on the line to serve our country, to every single American who believes strongly that we must end this long-standing foreign policy of being the world's police and waging these regime change wars, which is really the legacy of Hillary Clinton. Then we are traitors to the nation that we love. This is despicable on so many levels.
When you say regime change wars, what do you mean by that?
This long-held foreign policy of the United States, of which Hillary Clinton was a champion of for a very long time, of going around the world, acting as the world's police, overthrowing and toppling dictators that we don't like. Again, wars that I've served in, the war in Iraq, the toppling of Gaddafi in Libya, and the ongoing regime change war in Syria. This is what we're talking about. This is what I have been strongly calling for an end to. And this is the reason why she and her minions are trying to smear me, smear my character, and undermine my campaign, labeling me as a foreign agent, as a traitor to my country. I am running as a Democrat to take our party back, away from the control of people like Hillary Clinton and the warmongering and corrupt, powerful establishment, and return our party into the hands of the people. This is a dangerous message that's being sent to the American people, that if anyone, any veteran, any service member, any American stands up and speaks out for ending these regime change wars, of ending this long-held foreign policy, this is how they will be treated. Let's stay focused on the issue at hand here, that Hillary Clinton is labeling me as a foreign agent and a traitor, smearing and undermining my campaign, both directly herself and indirectly through her proxies, who've been doing this really since I announced my candidacy for president. The reason why she's doing this is because she knows that she can't control me. She knows that she's not going to be able to manipulate me if I'm elected president, to be able to continue these warmongering policies that she has championed throughout her career. Look, here, let me tell you what this is about. This is about Hillary Clinton sending a very strong message saying that because I am and have long been calling for an end to our country's foreign policy of waging one regime change war after the next, the likes of which we've seen in Iraq, in Libya, and ongoing in Syria, and because I'm calling for an end to this new Cold War and nuclear arms race, that I am a Russian asset and that I am a traitor to the nation that I love. And not only are they saying that about me, they are basically sending this message out to every veteran in this country, every service member, every American, anyone watching at home who is fighting for peace and who is calling for an end to these regime change wars, this new Cold War and arms race. They are saying that you are also a Russian asset, that you are also a traitor to this country. That's really what's happening here. And the reason why she's doing this is because ultimately she knows that she can't control me, that I stand against everything that she represents, and that if I'm elected president, if I'm the Democratic nominee and elected president, that she won't be able to control me, she won't be able to manipulate me, she won't be able to continue to work from behind the curtain, to continue these regime change wars that have been so costly. Thousands of my brothers and sisters in uniform were killed in Iraq, a war that she championed. Their blood is on her hands. I am calling for an end to these regime change wars. This is why she's speaking out strongly and smearing my character and trying to undermine my campaign. And just as she is doing this to me, this is what will happen to anybody who's doing the same.
Yeah, well, this is something that happened from literally the day I announced my candidacy for president. As I said it in my tweet earlier, it's become very clear now who's behind it and why. And it is Hillary Clinton and her proxies, the warmongering foreign policy establishment, who are conducting this coordinated smear campaign. And now we know exactly why. It's because I am standing up and speaking out strongly against the Hillary Clinton legacy, the warmongering legacy of waging these regime change wars, continuing to escalate these tensions between the United States, nuclear armed countries like Russia and China, this nuclear arms race, bringing more profits to the military industrial complex. As president, I will end these counterproductive policies, these regime change wars, this new Cold War and arms race, and redirect our taxpayer dollars back towards serving the needs of our people right here at home.
So what did you think when you heard that?
I mean, for me, honestly, Hillary's been dead on with so many things. She told us about Russia. She told us about the probable interference during the debate. She was Secretary of State. She has deep knowledge about world issues. I thought, where's the lie? I've often said that Tulsi is sort of the Trojan horse in this. I mean, she's polling only at 1.2%, yet she's still in the race. You have her being touted by people like Fox News personalities like Tucker Carlson.
She's endorsed.
She is endorsed by, by sort of the Russians.
David Duke.
David Duke. She has basically renounced that, but she's never renounced the Russian support. There have been about 20 Russian bot websites that have supported her since she's announced her run for the presidency.
She tweeted back and called Hillary a warmonger. Okay, so that does not do anything for me. She hasn't denied it. She hasn't said anything in her tweets. How dare you? It's outrageous. Of course I'm not. She didn't say that. No. She's just going after Hillary. And like you said, Hillary was right about almost everything. She's been exonerated with that nonsense that they pulled about her server already. So I think that there's something, I don't say that Tulsi is an agent. I just think that she could be a useful idiot the way Trump is a useful idiot to the Russians.
It really surprised me that Hillary Clinton wasn't smarter, more tactful in the way she talked about it. And frankly, if you're a Democrat, I think Tulsi has a lot to like. I think if anything, you should want...
No Democrat really likes her. That's why she's polling at 1.2%.
She doesn't like wars. She's attracting people that I think you need that might vote for Trump.
She's only attracting 1.2%.
When Jill Stein did it, and she's claiming that Jill Stein was a Russian asset in the last election, we didn't know it until after the election. Now, we're looking at this with open eyes. Maybe we know it before.
I want to start with something that I think is also important about facts, because recently on your show here...
I was just going to get to that.
Good. Helping you out.
You want me to ask you the question?
No, look, some of you have accused me of being a traitor to my country, a Russian asset, a Trojan horse, or a useful idiot, I think was the term that you used. Which basically means that I'm naive or lack intelligence to know what's going on.
They use that.
I want to let your viewers know exactly who I am.
All right.
Set the record straight. I am a patriot. I love our country. I am a strong and intelligent woman of color, and I have dedicated almost my entire adult life to protecting the safety, security, and the freedom of all Americans in this country. It was the attacks on 9/11.
We're getting a little bit far ahead of ourselves, but Franklin Graham finds you refreshing. He doesn't find me refreshing. Richard Spencer, the white nationalist leader, says he could vote for you.
Joy, this is why
you're on Tucker Carlson at least 10 times. Why don't you go on Chris Wallace's show?
This is why I'm here, because you and other people continue to spread these innuendos that have nothing to do with who I am.
Well, Hillary Clinton started it, and then you shot back at her, boy. You called her the queen of warmongers.
You doubled down, unfortunately, you doubled down on the baseless accusations that she made that strikes at the core of who I am. I'm a soldier. Because of the attacks on 9/11, I enlisted in the military to go after and defeat and destroy the evil that visited us on that day. I've served now for over 16 years, deployed twice the Middle East during the height of the war, where every single day I saw firsthand the terribly high human cost. It's why I ran for Congress.
We actually have the clip of Hillary Clinton, just to put this in context of what we're talking about. Let's take a look at that.
I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of, sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far. And that's assuming Jill Stein will give it up, which she might not, because she's also a Russian asset.
So
really? I mean, this is outrageous. This is outrageous and offensive on so many levels. I've served as a member of Congress now for almost 7 years, receiving high-level national security and intelligence briefings, serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, working to ensure the safety and security of the people of this country. This is why I'm running for president, to continue that commitment of service. It's offensive to me as a soldier, as an American, as a member of Congress, as a veteran, and frankly, as a woman, to be so demeaned in such a way.
But you called her the personification of rock.
So demeaned
She's a woman
in such
too.
a way. Well, I'm pointing to the fact that she has continued this legacy of being the world's police around the world, that has waged wars costing the lives of thousands of my brothers and sisters in uniform. I'm speaking out against that, and
What's
to
your evidence
change
to that?
To change.
Well,
Are you serious?
Let's hear it.
Are you serious?
Let's hear it.
I served in the war
Not
in
you,
Iraq.
her. You're saying that she's
exactly.
she's a
I
warmonger.
served
How do
in
you
the
come
war
up with
in
that?
Iraq
Yeah.
that she championed. She championed a regime change war
Did you not
in
believe
Libya.
in that war?
I believe the lies that were told to us.
Well, so did she.
Look, it is indisputable. It is indisputable to say anything other than the fact that Hillary. Let me just close this out. That Hillary Clinton, throughout her career, has led with a foreign policy of interventionism and being the world's police, going and toppling dictators in other countries that has caused such destruction and loss of life. I'm against that. I'm running for president to change that. Rather than actually debate me on the issues, she and others are resorting to these smear tactic campaigns, seeking to undermine me, smear my character, and sending a message to anyone who dissents. Toe the line, or you too will be smeared.
I think that it's unfortunate that we have someone on the stage who is attempting to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, who during the Obama administration spent 4 years full-time on Fox News criticizing President Obama.
That's
who
ridiculous,
has spent
Senator Harris. That's ridiculous.
Who has spent full-time criticizing people on this stage as affiliated with the Democratic Party. When Donald Trump was elected, not even sworn in, buddied up to Steve Bannon to get a meeting with Donald Trump in the Trump Tower, fails to call a war criminal by what he is as a war criminal, and then spends full time during the course of this campaign, again, criticizing the Democratic Party. What we need on the stage in November is someone who has the ability to win. And by that, we need someone on that stage who has the ability to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, and someone who has the ability to rebuild the Obama coalition and bring the party and the nation together. I believe I am that candidate.
Thank you, Senator. Congresswoman Gabbard, I'll give you a chance to respond.
What Senator Harris is doing is unfortunately continuing to traffic in lies and smears and innuendos because she cannot challenge the substance of the argument that I'm making, the leadership and the change that I'm seeking to bring in our foreign policy, which only makes me guess that she will, as president, continue the status quo, continue the Bush-Clinton-Trump foreign policy of regime change wars, which is deeply destructive. This is personal to me because I served in Iraq. I left my seat in the state legislature in Hawaii, volunteered to deploy to Iraq, where I served in a medical unit where every single day I saw the terribly high human cost of war. I take very seriously the responsibility that the president has to serve as commander-in-chief, to lead our armed forces, and to make sure always, no, I'm not going to put party interests first. I will put the interests of the American people above all else.
Congresswoman. I want to briefly give...
If your question is about experience, let's also talk about judgment. One of the foreign leaders you mentioned meeting was Bashar al-Assad. I have, in my experience, such as it is, whether you think it counts or not, since it wasn't accumulated in Washington, enough judgment that I would not have sat down with a murderous dictator like that.
Congresswoman Gabbard, let me allow you to respond.
Thank you. You were asked directly
specifically whether you would send our troops to Mexico to fight cartels, and your answer was yes. The fact checkers can check this out. No. But your point about judgment is absolutely correct. Our commander-in-chief does need to have good judgment. And what you've just pointed out is that you would lack the courage to meet with both adversaries and friends to ensure the peace and national security of our nation. I take the example of those leaders who have come before us, leaders like JFK, who met with Khrushchev, like Roosevelt, who met with Stalin,
like Donald Trump,
Reagan, who met and worked with Gorbachev. These issues of national security are incredibly important. I will meet with and do what is necessary to make sure that no more of our brothers and sisters in uniform are needlessly sent into harm's way fighting regime change wars that undermine our national security. I'll bring real leadership and experience to the White House.
I've got Tulsi Gabbard, and I got Steve Schmidt up there that took a shot at you a while ago. I want to give him a shot. Steve, would you repeat what you said about Tulsi Gabbard?
This woman, I thought your performance was dishonest. I think your positions are extreme. And one question I would have for you is, why did you go to Syria to meet Bashar al-Assad? What was the intent of your visit there? And why were you so dishonest with regard to the mayor, insisting that he called for plans to invade Mexico, which of course he did not?
Tulsi.
Well, if you look at what the mayor said in response to the woman who asked him the question about Mexico, I was merely citing what the mayor responded to. Look, the commander-in-chief and the qualifications necessary to serve in that role are incredibly important. The experience and understanding about foreign policy, about national security, is something that I bring to the table and that I challenged Pete Buttigieg on, showing that he lacks that experience. I've served in Congress for 7 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Homeland Security Committees, meeting with world leaders, working with military commands, getting high-level national security briefings focused on ensuring our nation's security, the safety and security and the freedom of the American people, and working towards peace. Right. That was why I was willing to meet with the brutal dictator of Bashar al-Assad in Syria in the interest of peace and national security, and why as president I'll be willing to meet with any leader from any other country if it means that we are able to ensure no more of my brothers and sisters in uniform are needlessly, unnecessarily sent into harm's way, fighting in these regime change wars that have been so costly and so destructive to my brothers and sisters in uniform and to every single American. This is why I'm calling for this sea change, a shift in our nation's foreign policy, away from the Bush-Clinton legacy of interventionism and more regime change wars.
Let me ask you about the fight in the Democratic Party. I'm looking at all the Democratic establishment figures, people I normally like, John Kerry, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton. You get down the list, they all supported the war in Iraq. Why were they hawks? Why so many Democrats who the party is not hawkish? Why are so many of their leaders hawks?
Look, I point to two things. One is you have the foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial complex in Washington that carries such a huge amount of influence over both parties.
Is it campaign contributions?
Both political parties.
I'm trying to think of why are politicians so hawkish in your party?
There are campaign contributions, the influence that these contractors have in this pay-to-play culture, this corrupt culture in Washington. But you also just have people who don't understand foreign policy and who lack the experience to make these critical decisions that impact our lives and the safety and security of the American people. This is what is so serious about what's at stake here.
But also find it odd that the way she talks about regime change wars is exactly the same way that Russia talks about them. Right. She uses this language that feels straight out of kind of the Kremlin. Sure. It is odd. Yeah. And that she went to see Bashar al-Assad and cannot take away from her interaction with him or her observation of him that he is a criminal who is not just hurting random people, he's hurting his own people.
The fact that she couldn't call him a war criminal is stunning.
That you can't see what he is also a weird Kremlin-y view that she has of the world that makes her an odd fit for a party of Democrats.
You supported Bernie in
Yeah.
2016. Is that where it started?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was something. Back in 2016, I was the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. Therefore, as an officer of the DNC, had to remain neutral in the presidential election, which was my plan to do so. I really made the decision to resign from that seat so that I could endorse Bernie Sanders, largely because of his difference with Hillary Clinton in foreign policy. You know, Hillary Clinton had, very much of an interventionist, in my opinion, kind of the war hawk, regime change war policy that she had shown throughout her time, both in the administration as well as a U.S. senator. And Bernie Sanders, leaned the other way. He's more of a non-interventionist. And I saw that in those debates at that time, the conversations that were had, the media was not bringing up this difference between the two of them so that voters could make an informed choice of who they want their commander-in-chief to be, which to me, just as, as a soldier, as a veteran, as an American, I'm like, how can you not be putting this issue at the forefront? So I resigned from that position, endorsed Bernie Sanders, started going out and just talking about and raising these issues on the campaign trail. But I remember one of the first interviews that I did on MSNBC, the host of the show saying, aren't you afraid of what the Clintons will do to you? Said this on live television. And
scary ass family.
Oh man.
My answer was no, obviously, but it was amazing. It was interesting to see the reaction, like the days after, when I first went back to DC after I made that announcement of endorsement. And friends of mine, politicians in Washington, they were like, "Man, Tulsi, like, go with God, sister."
It's a different animal. See, like, if you get into some sort of verbal altercation with Joe Biden, there's no concern for your life. Like, I'm not saying it's real or not, but the rumor is always, there's a thing called
Joe
the Clinton
Biden
body
is like,
count.
yeah,
I
Joe
mean, I
Biden
don't know
is
if
like
that's
Uncle
real.
Joe.
I don't think it is real. It's probably some of it, most of it. Let's say it's all made up. The fact that that's out there, that the thought is out there, that they will whack you.
Well, there's the people who are saying, hey, look, there are lists that are kept and your political career will be over. That was really the message that I got from people who've been around the block a few times. And I think the most recent thing that came up with what Hillary Clinton said about me is not a spat between two people. It really just shows the complete difference and the conflict in our foreign policy views of the what I call the Bush-Clinton doctrine of interventionism and regime change wars and warmongering versus what I'm putting forward, which is let's stop the regime change war, world's police policies, work to end this new Cold War and arms race, put the interests of the American people first, always ensuring that we have a strong and capable, ready military to defend our nation and our people. And honoring that service and sacrifice that our troops give by only sending them on missions worthy of their sacrifice, maximizing diplomacy, engagement with other countries in the world through cooperation rather than conflict, and always seeing war as a last resort. So that conflict that you're seeing in the media that's been playing out, and again, why you're seeing so much of the corporate media and the political machine attacking me is because of this difference. Is because of this change in foreign policy that I'm bringing about. Because when it comes right down to it, whether you're going back to the Cold War, back to Vietnam War, back to the Iraq War overthrowing Saddam Hussein, Libya, Gaddafi, the media has always kind of been this cheerleading voice for these wars to happen, sending a very clear narrative out to the American people. And I think it comes down to it's good business for them. It's good ratings, makes some money.
That she said that you were a Russian asset. That was the insinuation, right?
Yeah.
Like, what was the base of that? And how does someone
completely baseless?
But that's what's weird, right? How does someone who is running for president and is one of the most prominent politicians in our country, how do they get away with saying something that's such a huge accusation with no information to back it up?
When you look at the power of the Clinton machine, when you look at the power of the political establishment, which is made up of people who are either, part of the Clinton so-called family, or who are part of this political establishment that is built on the same foundation that Hillary Clinton, laid, when you look at the media establishment who've been pushing a lot of the same narrative, a lot of the same message, then you can see how somebody gets away with calling a sitting member of Congress, a candidate for president, a soldier actively serving the Army National Guard, veteran of 2 Middle East deployments, basically a traitor to the country that I love and that I'm willing to lay my life down for, and to get away with it without any evidence or base whatsoever.
Not just that, but no pushback.
No.
That was the most bizarre thing. No one said, well, hold on. What are you saying she is? You're saying she's a Russian asset. Define that. What do you mean by that? Do you mean an unwitting Russian asset? Are you saying that Russia's behind her to try to do something against Bernie or Elizabeth Warren or whatever the consensus pick is? Like, what are you saying? There was no questions like that.
There were no questions like that. And look, even if there were witting or unwitting, so she's basically either saying that I'm a traitor to my nation or that I am an unwitting asset, which means basically you are too stupid and too naive to know that you're being used to further the interests of a nation other than our own, both of which are deeply, deeply offensive. And again, without any base. And I think that's the, like, this is bigger. This is really not about me. The danger here of what she did and how the media responded and how almost every single other candidate for president refused to comment, refused to denounce what she said. I think Bernie is an exception. Marianne Williamson, Andrew Yang, couple of them had the courage to say, hey, look, this is ridiculous. The fact that was the response is really, it has a chilling effect on our freedom of speech in this country. And it sends a message that whether it's Tulsi Gabbard or any other American or any other veteran who dares to stand up and challenge the establishment, challenge this foreign policy narrative, call for peace, call for an end to these senseless, unnecessary regime change wars, then you too can be smeared. Your character can be smeared. But it shows us where we need to go, honestly. And you're talking about authentic, honest leaders who have integrity, and I think people are not as blind to that. People can tell.
Yeah.
People can tell if you're being real or not. All of those different labels and things that people are capitalizing on within the political world, I think, are the things that are turning off more and more people to the politics, because then it's like, well, if you're not branded with this label, then I'm not going to talk to you. Or I'm not going to have a conversation. Or it's this camp versus another camp, this tribe versus another tribe, rather than like recognizing even amongst our own families and friends and communities, like we figure out ways to talk things through and find ways to collaborate, and areas where we can agree to disagree on certain things, but we can do that with, what we in Hawaii call aloha, and with respect, and actually find a way through to move forward.